Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute mind-bending genius of the legendary Argentine author Jorge Luis Borges. We are setting the stage for a really wild journey into what you might call the architecture of the multiverse, and we'll be using his absolute masterpiece, The Garden of Forking Paths, as our main guide.
But before we even touch the plot, let me ask you something. What if every choice you ever made created a parallel universe? I want you to really imagine a reality where every single decision you make, whether it's what you had for breakfast, which job you took, or who you married, actually splits your timeline into diverging parallel futures. Now, I know it sounds like modern quantum physics or, a blockbuster sci-fi movie, right? But Borges was mapping this stuff out decades before the multiverse was a cultural staple.
Section 1. The Spy and the Labyrinth, a thrilling race against time.
We're taking a micro to macro approach today, which means we are dropping right into the middle of a high-stakes World War I spy chase. The timeline here is frantically compressed. Our protagonist, Yu's son, is a Chinese scholar acting as a spy for Germany in Britain. And, well, his cover is completely blown. His contact is dead, and his communication channels are entirely cut. Within just the first 10 minutes, he realizes his telephone book is compromised. The next 10 minutes, a desperate, frantic train ride to Ashgrove, which buys him a brief 40-minute lead. Finally, he spends those 40 minutes walking through the quiet English countryside to the house of a man named Stephen Albert. He's desperately trying to figure out how to communicate a bombing target back to Berlin before he gets captured. The clock is ticking, and it is loud.
So who's actually chasing him? Well, you've got Yutsun, our philosophical spy. He's deeply conflicted, super analytical, driven by this intense need to prove himself, and he's operating in a world of complex branching choices. And then, hot on his heels, is Captain Richard Madden, the British agent hunting him down. Madden is relentless. He's linear, highly disciplined, and moving on a single direct trajectory to capture his target. It's literally a clash between a complex philosophical mind trying to navigate multiple possibilities and a relentless linear force of action. Madden represents a reality that demands a single brutal outcome.
Section 2. A map of parallel times. Unlocking Sui Pen's secret.
We shift gears from that frantic city chase to the quiet, almost timeless English countryside, where Yutsun meets a sinologist named Stephen Albert. The crucial point of their meeting really hinges on this incredibly enigmatic quote from Yutsun's ancestor, Sui Pen. "I leave to the several futures, not to all, my garden of forking paths." Sui Pen was this fascinating guy who actually renounced his power as a governor to do two things: write a novel and build a labyrinth. For generations, his descendants thought he totally failed at both. The manuscript he left behind was a chaotic, contradictory mess. Characters would die in one chapter and just reappear alive in the next, and the physical labyrinth never found. This quote just completely baffled his family.
But Stephen Albert, he finally cracks it. The grand revelation is that the chaotic book isn't a failure at all. Albert realizes that the novel and the labyrinth are literally the exact same thing. The Garden of Forking Paths is not a physical maze of space, like, hedges or brick walls. It's a conceptual maze of time. Sui Pen built a perfectly designed literary labyrinth where all possible choices and parallel timelines exist simultaneously. In his book, when a character makes a decision, they don't eliminate the other options, they choose all of them at once, branching reality into multiple futures.
Section 3. The Mathematics of Infinity. Graph Theory and Infinite Permutations. Okay, so Borges isn't just spinning a clever story here. He is literally mapping out advanced math. Let's ground this playfully with graph theory. Say you wake up and choose between tea or coffee. Boom, 2 paths. Then you choose to go for a run or take a bath. Now we've got 4 paths. Make another simple daily decision, and we're at 8. As you keep going, you can see how these choices compound exponentially into an infinite web of realities. Borges understood that if you assume an infinite series of these steps, you create a dizzying, exponentially growing net of divergent, convergent, and parallel times. Every lived reality is just one tiny path through the tree. Borges loved playing with the math of infinity. Take the concept of Aleph Naught. The mathematician Cantor proved there are actually hierarchies of infinities, which is pretty wild to think about. Aleph Naught represents the smallest infinity, kind of like the set of all counting numbers, 1, 2, 3, and so on forever. But the number of possible paths in a continuously branching timeline is actually a larger, uncountably infinite set. Borges uses this uncountably infinite nature of time to contrast with our very limited, linear, and honestly often tragic human experience. We can only ever walk one path, even if infinite paths exist. Then there's recursion, another mathematical concept Borges was obsessed with. Recursion is basically a process that just repeats itself indefinitely, forming an infinite chain stretching backward and forward. For example, in another one of his brilliant stories, The Circular Ruins, a guy spends months dreaming another man into existence, only to walk into a fire at the end and realize, wait, I'm just a phantom being dreamed by someone else. A man who dreams a man who dreams a man, out to infinity. Mind-blowing, right? And then we hit this terrifyingly massive number, 25 to the power of 1,312,000. This comes straight from Borges' famous story, The Library of Babel. The library represents every single possible 410-page book that can be constructed from just 25 symbols. To put that into perspective, it is a universe of vast, yet technically finite permutations. Somewhere in that library is the true story of your exact life, millions of slightly incorrect versions of your life, and just endless volumes of complete gibberish. It perfectly visualizes how Borges uses mathematics as a metaphor for the absurdity of searching for meaning in a nearly infinite universe. Section 4. Mirrors, Books, and Tigers. Decoding the Master's Symbols. Let's decode some of the recurring motifs Borges uses to navigate these massive mathematical ideas. The Labyrinth, as we've seen, is all about death, time, and the illusion of a single path. Mirrors? They stand for the infinite, duplication, and terrifying illusions, falsely promising infinity. The book represents arcane, endless, and often super dangerous knowledge. Big cats, like tigers or jaguars, symbolize enigmatic knowledge that our human brains can only partially grasp. And fire represents rebirth, regeneration, and the ultimate destruction of reality. Once you have this decoder key, his work just opens up completely. Section 5. The Contamination of Reality, when the labyrinth bleeds into life. All right, let's pull this all back to the climax of our WWI spy thriller. Critics often talk about the Borges list, which is basically 4 key themes weaving through all his work. You've got the double, like twins or reflections. You've got travel through time. You've got the story within a story, dealing with unreliable narrators. And crucially, the big one, the contamination of reality, where fiction literally bleeds into the real world. In The Garden of Forking Paths, all 4 of these converge beautifully as the conceptual labyrinth of Sui Pen bleeds right into Yu Tsun's grim present reality.
And this is where we hit the absolute tragic irony of the ending. Despite this beautiful intellectual connection he forms with Stephen Albert, who is literally the only man on Earth who truly understands his family's legacy, Yu Tsun sees the relentless Captain Madden approaching. Time is up. The infinite possibilities suddenly collapse into a single brutal linear path. Yu Tsun shoots Stephen Albert dead. Why? Because the city the Germans need to bomb is actually named Albert. By murdering this innocent scholar, Yu Tsun turns a human life into a coded newspaper headline. He successfully signals the target to Berlin, but man, at a terrible moral cost. A beautiful intellectual connection transforms into a cold, violent signal of war.
This terrifying reality is summed up so perfectly in a powerful quote from Borges himself. One concept corrupts and confuses the others. I am not speaking of evil whose sphere is ethics. I'm speaking of the infinite. See, infinity just totally destabilizes our cozy understanding of morality, choice, and truth. If every outcome happens somewhere in the multiverse, how do we weigh a single murder in this one? Yu Tsun acts ruthlessly in his current reality, even while knowing that in another branching path of that labyrinth, he and Albert might actually be the greatest of friends. Which leaves us here. So, in the garden of your own choices, are you the dreamer or are you the dreamed? When you make a simple choice today, just remember the paths you didn't take. They might literally be playing out in a parallel timeline right now. I hope this explainer gave you a totally new lens to view reality through. Keep questioning the architecture of your world, and we'll see you in the next one.